By winter 1942, 1 year after Pearl Harbor, our fighting forces were building up fast and being deployed around the world, fighting beside Australian troops in New Guinea. And on Guadalcanal, where they had taken over from the long embattled Marines. Large-scale amphibious landings had been made successfully in Africa. Joining up with the British in the fighting French. Other Army units were arriving in overseas staging areas in North Ireland, England, and Australia. As our combat and support forces began to encircle the globe, our lengthening supply lines were stretched to the utmost. An army cannot fight without food, clothing, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies and services, transportation, armor, and aircraft that must be constantly supplied with fuel and as constantly serviced, repaired, or replaced.
During the fighting on the vast stretches of arid desert land in North Africa, German General von Ravenstein, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, remarked that North Africa is a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. An American or Allied commander could very well have made the same statement.
On the other side of the world, in the Southwest Pacific, support for the combat troops was even more difficult in an entirely different kind of warfare. Logistics is the transportation, supply, and quartering of troops. Procurement of all required military equipment and materials, shipping and distributing cargo to the right place to arrive at the right time. In World War II, American military planners successfully solved the biggest logistics problems the world has ever known. Our lines of supply fanned out like a network around the world, extending northward to Alaska and the Aleutians, to the Panama Canal, westward across the Pacific to a chain of islands, on to China by way of India, to Burma, to Australia, eastward across the Atlantic to North Africa, the length of the Mediterranean, the Middle East and the southern route through the Persian Gulf, Russia, to Great Britain, Iceland, and to Russia by way of Murmansk in the far north, and ultimately the entire continent. Under Lend-Lease, we shipped to our allies approximately $25 billion worth of war material. These included approximately 850,000 pieces of equipment, tanks, locomotive, trucks, Free French forces in North Africa were supplied enough arms and material to equip 12 combat divisions. Billions of dollars worth of supplies went to China, flown there from India. To Russia alone, over the submarine-infested route to Murmansk, went almost 500,000 pieces of heavy equipment, railroad rolling stock, and clothing. Vast stores of munitions and equipment went to England and the Commonwealth. All this while we were supplying our own widely deployed forces and building mountains of supplies for the invasion of Europe yet to come. The miracle of supply achieved by the United States in World War II was unimaginable. It represented the outpouring of a great nation's energies and resources, not for conquest, but to win freedom for men who would be free everywhere.
Mighty America had come fully alive. A revitalized agriculture reached the largest food production goals in the history of mankind. Food not only for ourselves and our allies, but for the hungry populations of the countries our armies would liberate and occupy. Industrial output staggered the imagination, brought renewed hope to our hard-pressed allies, dismay and consternation to the aggressors. It amazed even ourselves. At long last, the United States had come of age, had found a vitality, a strength, and a will to do that was phenomenal in all the annals of men and nations. Great convoys of ships stretched out as far as the eye could see, carrying the millions of tons of cargo we kept pouring overseas. All of this in support of G.I. Joe. And who was G.I. Joe? He was the oft-times grimy, unshaven, heart and soul, blood and guts of America, the citizen soldier, the immortal image of the American fighting man whose forefathers had starved and frozen at Valley Forge to fight on and triumph at Yorktown, and again a few years later at the Battle of New Orleans. He had been a raw recruit at Bull Run, but emerged the victor at Gettysburg and the winner of a great and tragic civil war at Appomattox. He was the man who drove the enemy to defeat at Chateau Thierry, at Saint Mihiel and the Meuse Argonne. He was and is the American soldier personified. And who were his leaders? Marshall, Eisenhower, MacArthur, Bradley, Patton, men who possessed the indomitable spirit and genius of Washington, Grant, Robert E. Lee, John J. Pershing. This was the heritage of American military leadership in World War II, a heritage they could not and would not fail. Their one and only goal, victory. From buck privates to four-star generals, these were the priceless outpouring of America's greatest resource, the product of more than a century and a half of freedom, of democracy in action, of a great dream that their forefathers had fought for and made a reality, and which these, their sons, were fighting to preserve. But even amidst the tensions of war, there were precious hours of respite in which battle-weary men found rest and relaxation and brief moments of humor. But when they fought, they fought in bitter fighting. Nazi tanks hurled back Allied forces to the Algerian border. But then, combined American, British, and French units stopped the German-Italian drive at Kasserine and overran Tunisia. In the Pacific, on bloody Guadalcanal, fighting an entirely different kind of warfare, United States troops overcame the last fanatical Japanese resistance and won complete control of the island and its airfields. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Allied bombers sank 8 transports and 4 destroyers of a Japanese convoy of 16 ships. "181 days after the Allied landings in North Africa, Tunis and Bizerte fell before the drive of American, British, and French forces. The drive reached its full fury with lightning speed, in the air and on the ground. The enemy was hit harder and harder. crushed in a fight from which there was no escape. In 5 days, all German resistance in Tunisia collapsed. The Axis forces surrendered. The myth of Hitler's super race was beginning to crack. In the faraway Aleutian Islands, American troops had landed on Attu. Still farther away in New Guinea, American and Australian troops drove back the stubborn and fanatical enemy in close fighting in malaria-infested jungle. Among the battle casualties we had suffered while fighting in the Buna area were 3 of our general officers, shot in action within less than 100 yards of the Japanese lines. From victories on the deserts of North Africa, the fog-bound Aleutians, to the tropical island of Guadalcanal and the New Guinea jungles, where our troops were driving forward against desperate Japanese resistance, we had indeed spread our forces around the world. Who was it that once said, the United States was incapable of fighting a two-front war? Within less than 16 months, the United States Navy had performed a miracle of salvage. Of all the ships sunk or damaged on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, all but 3 were back in service and in fighting trim by May 1943. An achievement on a scale unequaled in naval history. In Russia, the Germans had taken virtually all of Stalingrad by late 1942. Their conquest was short-lived. Early in 1943, the Russians launched a massive counter. Retook Stalingrad, destroying a Nazi army of 330,000, capturing 17 of Hitler's generals. The tide had started to turn in Russia. In June of 1943, hundreds of Royal Air Force planes engaged in a non-stop aerial offensive over occupied Europe that continued unremittingly for 10 days. While the tide was turning in the air over Hitler's fortress Europe, American Army, Navy, and Air Forces, along with those of Australia and New Zealand, launched a concerted offensive to drive the Japanese out of New Guinea and the northern Solomon Islands. Enemy forces on Rendova Island were wiped out. Our troops drove for the Munda airfield on New Georgia Island. With all of North Africa in Allied hands, preparations for Operation Husky were begun immediately to attack the soft underbelly of Europe. The immediate target, Sicily. Little time was lost. Only 60 days after the surrender of Axis forces in North Africa, Patton's 7th Army invaded Sicily simultaneously with British and Canadian troops under Montgomery. Some 3,000 craft were employed to land an initial force of 160,000 troops. Almost 14,000 vehicles, about 600 tanks, nearly 2,000 guns. But Sicily was held by more than 200,000 Italian and German troops, strongly entrenched on rugged terrain. It was to be a tough, hard-fought campaign.
In 1940, our Army numbered a little more than 250,000 men. Well-led force. Thanks to the intensive training program under General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, American soldiers had never before been as well trained and equipped to fight as were our soldiers in World War II. Certainly, the veterans of the North African campaign learned that intensive training pays off, and now they were continuing to prove it in Sicily.
Our drive across Sicily was aimed at the key port of Messina, just across the narrow straits which separate Sicily from the toe of the Italian mainland. The Germans fought stubbornly, utilizing every defensive advantage offered by the rugged terrain. Italian forces offered little resistance. Patton's 7th American Army attacked from one side, while General Montgomery's 8th British Army pressed forward from the other. Citizen soldier G.I. Joe had fought and defeated the best the Nazi had to offer in North Africa and had taken the enemy's measure. Now he was a veteran who had growing confidence in himself and in his leadership. He was a soldier. Whether he knew it or not, he was adding new glory to the traditions of the American fighting man. And at war's outcome, the word defeat had never been written on the scrolls of that fine tradition. In many areas, there was nothing more than a rut or a road. So units of the 7th Army did a little amphibious leapfrogging along the coast in their push for Messina. While our 7th Army pushed the Nazis across Sicily, in faraway New Guinea, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment made an airdrop at Nadzan, while American and Australian ground forces continued to press forward. Our growing air power made a daylight raid on military objectives in the heart of Italy with 500 bombers. On Sicily's north coast, Patton's 7th captured Palermo and drove on eastward toward Messina. In the air, 177 American B-24 bombers raided the oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania with 300 tons of explosives. initiative no longer belonged to the Nazi fascist axis, in the air or on the ground. The ruthless drive for world conquest had been stopped all the way around the earth. From North Africa to the Pacific, where U.S. Army troops and Marines captured the Munda airfield on the island of New Georgia. On the same day our troops took Munda, Soviet forces smashed German defenses in central Russia. Key military targets on the Italian mainland were being mauled by our Air Force. Our ground forces were also hitting the enemy with devastating power. The crushing defeat suffered by the Axis in North Africa and Patton's advance toward the Straits of Messina were psychological poison to a badly shaken fascist regime. The once triumphant Caesar Guard, who had looked like this at the height of his power, when his fascist legions had slaughtered and conquered Ethiopian tribesmen who fought with spears and ancient guns, now looked like this. Mussolini had led his people through a nightmare of military disasters. His arrogant dictatorship had come to an end. Retributive justice was close at hand. The King of Italy ordered Marshal Pietro Badoglio to organize a new government and conduct secret negotiations for surrender. A separate peace by Italy was the last thing Hitler wanted. The collapse of Mussolini and his fascist regime brought additional German forces pouring into Italy. From fighting ally, the Nazi was now the unwelcome intruder who would wage his battles of fierce resistance on Italian soil, bringing further ruin and suffering to an exhausted and war-sick people. On the 17th of August, 1943, 38 days after the invasion began, Patton's 7th Army took Messina, and all Sicily was in Allied hands. As well as 100,000 Italian prisoners. the Nazis had escaped to the mainland across the Straits of Messina. To land on the toe of the Italian boot. Six days later, American forces struck the beach at Salerno, 30 miles south of Naples. They met stiff enemy resistance. Days after the landings, the hurriedly reinforced enemy launched a strong counterattack, pouring in some of its best troops. For a time, our foothold was precarious. But supported by a concentration of combined firepower from aircraft, naval guns, and artillery, the Allies held the beachhead. The heavy pounding by land, sea, and air was too much for the Nazis. They fell back as our own forces pushed on toward Naples. By then, Italy had surrendered unconditionally, was officially out of the war. October 1st, 1943. Elements of General Mark Clark's Fifth Army entered the city of Naples. They were greeted not as conquerors, but as liberators. The citizens of Naples knew that we and our allies were the only hope of driving the Germans from their homeland. Here, as elsewhere, a new problem confronted our invasion forces: how to provide government for the civilian population. Years of fascism had promised plenty, but delivered only strife and hunger. Unless such centers of hungry population along a route of advance are well controlled, the advance is hampered. Communications break down, supply channels clog up. In Naples, the Allies met the challenge and thwarted chaos. The Naples water supply presented another challenge to the Allied forces. This problem was also mastered. government was a necessity, one which also had a direct influence on post-war rehabilitation throughout Europe. Following the fall of Naples, we expected our advance to continue. It did, but only for a brief period. The mountainous regions of central Italy provided the Germans with a number of natural defense lines. These, together with the closing in of the Italian winter, virtually stopped our forces in their tracks, scarcely 80 miles from Rome. While our fighting men in Italy were faced with a veritable stalemate, an entirely different kind of war was going on in the faraway Pacific, where Allied forces landed on Mono and Sterling Islands in a campaign launched to drive the Japanese from Bougainville. We invaded the Gilbert Islands. The 2nd Marine Division took Tarawa after 76 hours of bloody fighting. Heavy casualties were suffered. But the Japanese were wiped out. Elements of the Army's 27th Infantry Division took Macon and the neighboring atoll. Air Corps was engaged in massive bombing of the industrial heart of Germany, devastating Nazi plants and marshalling yards. But the Nazis' Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, had yet to come. The bitterest of large-scale battles had yet to be fought, and some of these were soon to come on the Italian front, where strong defensive positions were held by a tough and stubborn enemy. That and the weather had bogged down our advance. It was winter 1943. The stage was set for the Cairo-Tehran talks. Roosevelt and Churchill met with Chiang Kai-shek at Cairo. Even at the moment fighting was most intense in Italy, high-level master plans continued to be made for the invasion of France and for other Allied operations throughout the world. At Cairo, talks centered on the relation of European operations to the war in the Pacific. From Cairo, Roosevelt and Churchill flew to Tehran, where for the first time during the war, they met with Marshal Stalin, dictator of Soviet Russia. The Allied leaders failed to agree on everything, but one thing they did agree upon was that the invasion of Normandy in southern France must and would take place sometime during the following summer of 1944. For some time, there had been doubt as to who would command Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Roosevelt, en route home from Tehran, stopped off at Tunis to see General Eisenhower and to tell him that he was to command Overlord. The grand design for victory in Europe was now completed. But so far as the Allies in Italy were concerned, France and the cross-channel invasion were a long way off. It was to be a tragically long winter of hard fighting in Italy. There was the battle for Monte Cassino. To bypass the mountainous terrain holding up our advance in southern Italy, forces made an amphibious landing at Anzio, only 35 miles south of Rome. Heavy Nazi resistance stalled the breakout from the beaches. Finally, we blasted our way out of the pocket. The landings at Anzio convinced Hitler that we were launching an all-out campaign in Italy. He rushed 8 more divisions to reinforce his army in Italy, and the stalemate was resumed.
In the Pacific, Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands is taken by an amphibious force as our advance in the Central Pacific continues.